I'm not proud of my story, but it's mine. It's tangled, like a knot you keep pulling at but can't quite undo. And every thread you tug only seems to make it worse. I never meant for things to unravel the way they did, but intentions often matter little when faced with the gravity of our choices. The day he proposed, I felt the world shift beneath me, not in the way it should have, not with the kind of joy that makes you lightheaded or the certainty that grounds you. No. It was a sinking, visceral pull, like stepping onto a bridge and realizing the wood is rotted beneath your feet. Yet I said yes. I said yes because it felt like the right thing, or at least the thing that was expected of me. Andrew had always been steady. He was the kind of man who made plans 6 months in advance, who carried a spare tire in the trunk and knew how to use it. He wasn't flashy or impulsive, but there was safety in his predictability. When he looked at me that evening, eyes a shade of moss after rain, lips trembling ever so slightly as he held out the ring, I saw love, genuine, unflinching love, and I hated myself for not feeling it back in the same way. Some nights I stared at the ring on my finger and wondered if it was possible to feel two entirely opposing things at once. The weight of it was palpable, a constant reminder of Andrew's love and the life we were building. And yet, it felt like a shackle, a beautiful glittering chain tethering me to a version of myself I wasn't sure I wanted to be. In the quiet moments, when Andrew wasn't around, the guilt was deafening. It pressed against my chest, a suffocating pressure that left me gasping for air. What am I doing? The question looped endlessly in my mind, a mantra of self-condemnation that refused to relent. And yet, when I was with Damon, the guilt melted away. In his presence, the world felt sharper, more vibrant. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word ignited something in me I hadn't felt in years, or perhaps had never felt at all. But it wasn't just passion. It was something deeper, something darker. With Damon, I wasn't the version of myself that smiled politely and played by the rules. I was raw, untamed, unfiltered. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. One evening, as I sat alone in the apartment I shared with Andrew, the silence became unbearable. The wedding invitations were spread out on the coffee table, pristine and untouched, waiting for me to address them. I picked one up, running my fingers over the embossed lettering, Andrew and Charlotte. I stared at our names, trying to imagine what they looked like on a mailbox, on a holiday card, on a gravestone. My chest tightened. I reached for my phone before I could think better of it, dialing Damon's number with trembling fingers. "Charlotte," he answered, his voice low and familiar. "I can't do this," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I can't keep living like this." There was a pause, and I could hear the faint hum of music in the background. "What's going on?" "I'm supposed to be happy," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm supposed to love him. He's everything I've ever wanted, or everything I thought I wanted. But it feels like I'm suffocating." Damon didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured. "Then why are you doing it?" "Because it's too late," I said, my voice barely audible. "Because I've built this life with him, and if I walk away now, I'll destroy him. I can't do that to him." "And what about you?" Damon asked. "What happens to you if you keep pretending?" His words cut through me like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. I wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand, but the truth lodged itself in my throat. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I tried to throw myself into wedding preparations, hoping the distraction would quiet the chaos in my mind. But every choice felt like a betrayal, every yes another nail in the coffin of my authenticity. And yet the thought of walking away was equally unbearable. Andrew didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve my lies, my half-hearted devotion, my wandering heart. He deserved someone who loved him the way he loved me, with unwavering certainty. Why can't that be enough? The pivotal moment came 2 weeks before the wedding. I was at the boutique for my final dress fitting, standing on a pedestal surrounded by mirrors that reflected every angle of the woman I was supposed to be. The dress was stunning. Ivory lace, cascading in delicate patterns, hugging my body like a second skin. It was the kind of dress that made strangers stop and stare, that whispered promises of happily ever after. But as I stood there, staring at my reflection, all I could see were the cracks. The seamstress bustled around me, pinning and adjusting with practiced precision. My mother sat nearby, beaming with pride, her hands clasped in her lap as if she were holding on to the moment itself. "You look beautiful, darling," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Andrew is going to lose his mind when he sees you." I forced a smile, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." But inside I was screaming. When I left the boutique, I felt like I was walking in a fog. The world around me seemed distant, muffled, as though I were moving underwater. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I fished it out absently, glancing at the screen. It was Damon. "I need to see you." An hour later, I was sitting across from him in a dimly lit bar. He looked different that night, tense, his usual smirk replaced by a seriousness that unnerved me. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Charlotte, we need to talk." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. "About what?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "About what we're doing, what you're doing." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I want you to be honest with yourself," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're about to marry someone, and you're still here with me. What does that tell you?" "That I'm a terrible person," I said bitterly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "No," Damon said, his tone softening. "It tells me you're not as sure about this wedding as you're pretending to be." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," he said, leaning closer. "You're lying to yourself, to Andrew, to everyone. And sooner or later, it's all going to come crashing down." I left the bar in a daze, Damon's words echoing in my mind. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing and doing something about it were two entirely different things. When I got home, Andrew was sitting on the couch, his laptop open and spreadsheets scattered around him. He looked up when I walked in, smiling in that effortless way of his, the way that had always felt so steady, so safe. "Hey, how was the fitting?" he asked, closing his laptop and setting it aside. "It was fine," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. He stood and crossed the room to me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "I can't wait to see you in that dress," he murmured, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I stiffened in his embrace, guilt and shame coursing through me like a tidal wave. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to blurt out everything. The affair, the doubts, the fear that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. But instead, I stayed silent. And in that silence, the cracks widened. The wedding day arrived cloaked in sunlight and promises, as though the universe itself was conspiring to make everything look perfect. The air smelled of fresh-cut roses and lavender, and the sky was an endless expanse of blue. Guests milled about the garden venue, their laughter and chatter weaving a tapestry of anticipation. I stood in the bridal suite, staring at myself in the full-length mirror. The dress fit like a dream, every lace detail whispering of a future I wasn't sure I deserved. My hair was swept into an elegant chignon, a few loose strands framing my face. I looked like the picture of a radiant bride, But behind my carefully painted smile, my heart was pounding with dread. "You ready, sweetheart?" my mother asked, stepping into the room. Her eyes glistened with tears as she took me in, her expression a mix of pride and nostalgia. "Almost," I said, my voice barely audible. She walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You look beautiful. Andrew's a lucky man." I forced a smile, nodding. "Thank you." When she left the room, I turned back to the mirror, gripping the edges of the vanity to steady myself. My reflection stared back at me, a stranger in white. Damon hadn't called, hadn't texted since that night at the bar. I told myself it was for the best, that the silence gave me space to focus on Andrew and the life we were about to begin. But the absence of his voice, his presence, gnawed at me. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. 5 minutes. "Charlotte!" the wedding planner chirped. I nodded, though she couldn't see me, and took a deep breath. My hands trembled as I adjusted my veil, the lace brushing against my bare shoulders. And then my phone buzzed on the vanity. My stomach twisted. As I picked it up, Damon's name flashing across the screen. "Don't do it. 3 words. That was all it said. My legs felt like they might give out as I walked down the aisle. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like 1,000 stones. The guests blurred into a sea of faces, their smiles, and whispers a distant hum. And then I saw Andrew, standing at the altar, his face lighting up as I approached. His love for me was written in every line of his expression, in the way his hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. I wanted to cry. Not from joy, but from the crushing guilt that had become my constant companion. As I reached the altar, Andrew took my hand, his touch warm and steady. The officiant began speaking, his voice a soothing cadence I barely registered. "Do you, Charlotte, take Andrew to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The question hung in the air, each word cutting through the fog in my mind. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Andrew's eyes searched mine, his brow furrowing in concern. "Charlotte?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Time seemed to slow. The world around me faded until it was just the two of us, standing on the precipice of forever, and then finally I spoke. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My gaze darted to Andrew's face, so open, so full of love, and I felt the walls of my carefully constructed life begin to crumble. My voice faltered, barely more than a whisper. Andrew's grip on my hand tightened, a silent plea for reassurance. "It's okay," he murmured, his eyes soft and patient. But it wasn't okay. It would never be okay. "I can't do this." The words fell from my lips like stones, heavy and irrevocable. Gasps rippled through the crowd behind us, but I barely heard them. My entire world had narrowed to Andrew, to the shock and hurt that flashed across his face like a thunderclap. "Charlotte," he began, but I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I'm so sorry," I choked out, my voice breaking. "I thought I could, but I can't. I can't marry you." The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew's hand dropped from mine, and I saw the color drain from his face. He looked like I'd struck him, his jaw working as though he were trying to form words but couldn't find them. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly, but no one moved. "I'll explain," I said, my voice trembling. "I owe you that much. Just not here. Not like this." I ran. The moment I stepped away from the altar, the weight of my decision hit me like a tidal wave. My legs carried me down the aisle and out of the garden, past the confused murmurs and shocked faces of family and friends. The cool air hit my face as I reached the parking lot, my chest heaving with sobs. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, so badly I almost dropped it. Damon. The call rang twice before he picked up. "Charlotte?" "I did it," I said, my voice trembling. I told him I couldn't go through with it. There was a pause on the other end, and then Damon exhaled, sharply. Where are you? At the venue, I said, wiping at my eyes. I don't know what to do. I feel like I've ruined everything. I'm coming to get you, he said, his tone firm. Stay where you are. When Damon's car pulled up, I climbed in without hesitation. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a tissue and started driving. The silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. Do you hate me? I asked finally, my voice small. Damon glanced at me, his expression unreadable. No, but I hate what you've been doing to yourself. His words stung, but I knew he was right. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, staring out the window as the world blurred past. You figure it out, Damon said simply. One step at a time, but you had to stop lying to yourself first. The fallout was a storm that swept through every corner of my life, leaving wreckage in its wake. The first phone call came from my mother. I'd barely slept when the shrill ring of my phone jolted me awake. I hesitated before answering, knowing full well what was waiting on the other end. Charlotte, she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and concern. What were you thinking? I wasn't, I admitted, my voice hoarse from crying. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but you did, she interrupted sharply. Do you know what you've done to Andrew? To his family? To us? I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. Mom, I know. I know I've made a mess of everything, but I couldn't go through with it. It wouldn't have been fair to him. And cheating on him was fair? She snapped, the words cutting like glass. There it was, the truth I'd been trying to bury. I could feel the weight of her disappointment through the phone, and it was almost unbearable. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her tone was softer but no less stern. You need to fix this, Charlotte. Not for us, not even for Andrew. For yourself. You can't keep running from your mistakes. Andrew didn't call. I thought about reaching out to him, drafting a dozen messages that I could never bring myself to send. I knew he deserved answers, an apology, anything, but the thought of facing him made my stomach churn. A week later, he showed up at my apartment. I froze when I opened the door, my breath catching at the sight of him. He looked worn. His usually impeccable appearance was frayed at the edges, his shirt rumpled, his hair disheveled. But it was his eyes that broke me. They were tired, hurt, and searching. Can I come in? He asked, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. I stepped aside, closing the door behind him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I didn't expect to see you, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew turned to face me, his jaw clenched. I didn't expect to have my life turned upside down in front of 100 people, but here we are. I flinched at his words, guilt twisting like a knife in my chest. Andrew, I'm sorry. Don't, he said sharply, holding up a hand. Don't apologize unless you're ready to tell me the truth. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I didn't want to hurt you. I swear that was never my intention. But you did, he said, his voice cracking. Why, Charlotte, was it something I did? Was I not enough for you? No, I said quickly, shaking my head. You were everything anyone could ever want. You were perfect, Andrew. But I wasn't. He stared at me, his brows furrowing. So you cheated on me because you weren't perfect? Do you hear how that sounds? Tears welled in my eyes. I was scared, okay? I didn't know if I was ready for forever, and instead of facing that, I ran. I made mistakes. Terrible, unforgivable mistakes. But they weren't about you. They were about me and my own cowardice. Andrew let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Well, at least you're honest now. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, I said, my voice trembling. But I'm sorry. For everything. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally looked up, there was a sadness in his gaze that pierced me to my core. I loved you, Charlotte, he said quietly. And I think a part of me always will. But I can't be around you right now. I need to figure out how to move on. Losing Andrew was just the beginning. Friends who had once been eager to celebrate my engagement now avoided my calls. The whispers and sideways glances at work made me feel like a stranger in my own life. But the worst part was facing myself. Every mirror, every quiet moment forced me to confront the person I'd become. The lies I'd told, the pain I'd caused. It was all there staring back at me. I started therapy, hoping to untangle the mess of guilt and fear that had led me to this point. Slowly, painfully, I began to unpack my choices, to understand the patterns and insecurities that had driven me to sabotage my own happiness. Damon stayed for a while, but even that relationship began to falter under the weight of everything that had happened. "You need to figure out who you are," he said one night, his voice tinged with a sadness I couldn't ignore. "And I can't be your escape anymore." He was right. Andrew's path after the wedding that wasn't was both predictable and surprising. Predictable in the sense that he threw himself into work, using the hours and focus as a shield against the pain. Surprising because, despite everything, he didn't collapse under the weight of heartbreak. Instead, he transformed. The first time I saw him again, almost a year later, it was at a mutual friend's engagement party. A cruel twist of fate, but one I should have expected. I had debated not going, fearing the inevitable awkwardness, but I owed it to our friends. The evening was already a minefield of polite smiles and carefully avoided questions about my own failed engagement when Andrew walked in. I froze, my drink halfway to my lips, as he made his way through the crowd. He looked different. His posture was straighter, his suit sharper, his smile more confident. But it was his eyes that caught me. The sadness that once lingered there was gone, replaced by something steadier, more self-assured. He spotted me almost immediately, and for a moment, our gazes locked. My heart raced, a mix of guilt and longing coursing through me. He hesitated, then nodded politely before turning away to greet someone else. Over the next few weeks, I began to hear snippets about Andrew's life through mutual friends. "He's been traveling a lot," one said, almost casually. "Some consulting project overseas. Apparently, he's been to 6 countries in the past year." "Andrew? Oh, he's dating someone now," another chimed in. "She's a lawyer, I think. Really smart and driven. They seem happy." Happy. The word stung more than I cared to admit, even though it was what I wanted for him, or so I told myself. The second time we crossed paths was at a charity gala, one of those glittering events where everyone pretends the world isn't falling apart outside the ballroom doors. I was nervous as I entered, scanning the room for familiar faces. And then I saw him, standing by the bar with a woman who could have stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her hair was a cascade of dark waves, her red dress a bold contrast to the subdued tones of the evening. She laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm in a way that felt effortless, natural. I wanted to leave, to slip out before he noticed me, but fate, or perhaps some cruel twist of irony, had other plans. Charlotte. I turned to find him standing a few feet away, his expression neutral but polite. "Andrew," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil I felt. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the gala faded into the background as we stood there, 2 people with too much history and too many unsaid words between them. "You look well," he said finally, his tone measured. "So do you," I replied, my eyes flickering, to the woman who was now watching us with mild curiosity. Andrew followed my gaze. "Ah, that's Aaron," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. We've been seeing each other for a few months. She's beautiful, I said, forcing the words out. She is, he agreed, his voice soft but firm. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence between us felt heavy, weighted with all the things we couldn't undo. Charlotte, he said after a moment, his tone shifting. I don't hate you. I thought I did for a long time, but I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me. His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. Thank you, I said, my voice barely audible. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt like a gift. Take care of yourself, he said, and with that he turned and walked away. Years passed, and life carried us both forward in different directions. Andrew's name became less of a ghost in my mind and more of a memory, a bittersweet one that I carried quietly. I threw myself into rebuilding my life, finding solace in therapy and the small, steady progress of self-discovery. I started painting again, a passion I'd abandoned in the chaos of my mistakes. It became my anchor, a way to express the emotions I couldn't always put into words. Andrew, from what I occasionally heard through mutual friends, was thriving. He and Erin had become a power couple of sorts, her legal career flourishing and his business ventures expanding. They seemed untouchable, almost perfect. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. It was a rainy autumn evening when our paths crossed again. I was in a small, dimly lit bookstore, browsing for something to occupy the long, solitary nights. The bell above the door jingled, and I glanced up absently. And there he was. He looked older, more mature, but still unmistakably Andrew. His hair was slightly grayer at the temples, his posture as confident as ever. He was holding an umbrella, his coat damp from the rain. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't see me at first, his attention focused on the shelves. I could have slipped out unnoticed, but something kept me rooted in place. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still. Charlotte, he said, his voice soft but steady. Andrew, I replied, my voice tinged with surprise. A small, awkward silence settled between us, before he gestured to the shelves. Looking for anything in particular? Just something to read, I said, trying to keep my tone casual. And you? He shrugged, a faint smile playing at his lips. Same. Thought I'd wait out the rain. We fell into an easy conversation, the initial awkwardness giving way to something more familiar. He told me about his work, his travels, and how he'd recently moved back to the city. I told him about my art and the small gallery I'd started with a friend. Your gallery, he said, his eyes lighting up with genuine interest. I'd love to see it sometime. I hesitated, unsure if he meant it or if it was just polite conversation. But his expression was sincere, and before I could overthink it, I nodded. I'd like that. The visit to my gallery came a week later. Andrew arrived alone, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. These are yours? He asked, gesturing to a series of abstract paintings. I nodded, my cheeks warming. They're personal. They're beautiful, he said, his gaze lingering on one piece in particular, a swirl of blues and grays that I'd painted during one of my darkest moments. Thank you, I said quietly, his words settling over me like a balm. As we walked through the gallery, the conversation turned deeper, more reflective. He spoke about his relationship with Erin, how they'd parted ways amicably a year ago when their lives had taken different directions. It just wasn't meant to be, he said simply, his tone devoid of bitterness. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. And you? He asked, his eyes searching mine. Are you happy, Charlotte? The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'm getting there," I admitted. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Good. You deserve that." Andrew and I fell into an unexpected rhythm after that evening. What started as occasional text exchanges about books or art exhibitions gradually grew into something more consistent. There was a lightness to our interactions that hadn't been there before, as though the weight of our past had lifted just enough to make room for something new. Still, I was cautious. I'd spent years untangling myself from the guilt and mistakes of our shared history, and I wasn't sure what rekindling any kind of relationship with him, platonic or otherwise, might mean. One evening, a few months after he'd visited my gallery, Andrew invited me to coffee. We met at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The place was cozy, with mismatched chairs and the rich scent of espresso lingering in the air. Andrew was already seated when I arrived, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "You're early," I teased, slipping into the chair across from him. "I didn't want to miss you," he said, his smile soft but genuine. The warmth in his words unsettled me, stirring something I wasn't ready to name. We talked for hours, our conversation weaving effortlessly between the present and the past. He told me about the countries he'd visited, the people he'd met, and the lessons he'd learned. I shared stories of my own journey, the struggles and triumphs of rebuilding my life. At one point, the conversation turned to us, not directly, but close enough to feel the old wounds beneath the surface. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked, his tone careful, as though he didn't want to push too hard. "It's hard not to," I admitted, tracing the rim of my cup with my finger. "It shaped so much of who I am now." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Same here. It took me a long time to stop being angry. Not just at you, but at myself." "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For not seeing it sooner," he said quietly. "For ignoring the signs that you were struggling. I thought if I loved you enough, it would be enough for both of us." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. "Andrew, none of that was your fault. What happened was on me." "Maybe," he said, his gaze steady, "but I've learned that relationships are never that simple. There's always more to the story." That conversation became a turning point. We didn't rush into anything. Instead, we let our connection grow slowly, organically. There were moments of hesitation, of doubt on both sides, but there was also something unspoken between us, a quiet understanding that we were both different people now. One evening, as we walked through the city after dinner, Andrew stopped, abruptly. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low, "I don't want to pretend I haven't thought about this, about us, but I need to know if you feel the same way." His vulnerability caught me off guard. I looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but all I saw was honesty. "I don't know what the future looks like," I said, my voice trembling, "but I know I want you in it." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "Then let's figure it out together." Their story continued, no longer defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the possibilities of what could be. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real, built on a foundation of growth, forgiveness, and a shared willingness to try again. The months that followed were a delicate dance between rediscovery and hesitation. Andrew and I navigated the complexities of rebuilding something that had once crumbled, our past always lurking at the edges of our interactions. It was as though we were two people walking along the same path, but unsure whether the ground beneath us would hold. We started small, casual dates, afternoons spent in museums, dinners at new restaurants, long walks through the city. These were the moments when we began to reframe who we were to each other, no longer tethered to the history of betrayal and hurt, but rather to the present and the quiet understanding that we had both changed. But old habits die hard. And I found myself holding back at times, unsure of how much I could truly trust him again. My heart would race when his hand brushed against mine, and I would hesitate before letting him into the deeper parts of me, afraid that the same cracks in my heart would open again. And yet, there were nights when I'd catch him looking at me, across the table, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. And it was in those moments that I allowed myself to hope. I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make something new of what we'd broken. One evening, we sat together on a quiet park bench, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over everything. I rested my head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. "I still think about the past," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," he said, his voice steady. "But we can't let it define us, can we?" "No," I agreed softly. "But sometimes it feels like it's always there, watching, waiting to pull us under again." Andrew was quiet for a long moment, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of my hand. "I'm not perfect," he said finally, "and I know we'll face more challenges, but I want to try. For us. For whatever we are now." My heart swelled, a bittersweet tenderness flooding through me. "I want to try too," I said, my voice full of the unspoken promise that had lingered between us for so long. Time passed, and as it did, we learned the art of rebuilding trust, brick by fragile brick. There were setbacks, moments when old insecurities would creep in, but there were also moments of joy, of shared laughter, quiet understanding, and the soft touch of hands in the dark. Andrew and I never rushed into anything we weren't ready for, allowing our relationship to evolve slowly, taking the time to truly understand each other's needs, fears, and desires. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and that, I had come to realize, was enough. One afternoon, a year after our first tentative steps toward reconciliation, we sat in a small cafe sipping coffee. It had become a ritual of sorts, these quiet moments together, and in that space, I finally understood. "I love you," Andrew said, his voice low but firm. The words, once so impossible to say, now felt like a quiet truth. "I love you too," I whispered, the weight of the confession settling over me with a sense of relief. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration. Just two people, sitting across from each other, with the quiet certainty that their love had weathered the storms and had emerged stronger for it. Their relationship, though not without its scars, became a testament to the power of forgiveness, both of oneself and of others. And in the end, it was the understanding that love, in its truest form, was not about perfection, but about the willingness to try, again and again, that allowed them to build something lasting, something worth cherishing. As the years passed, Andrew and I settled into a routine, a quiet, steady rhythm that was both comforting and exhilarating. It was the kind of relationship I had never imagined we would have after everything. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was ours. We both carried the weight of our pasts, but we learned to hold it together, as if it were a shared secret that bound us. It wasn't a matter of forgetting, but of acknowledging and moving forward hand in hand. Our love was not loud, not dramatic. It was something deeper, more enduring. There were no grand gestures or promises of forever, just the quiet understanding that we had found something real, something worth protecting. But as with any love story, the challenges were never far behind. They didn't come in the form of betrayal this time, but in the everyday strains that come with building a life together. Compromises, misunderstandings, fears, and doubts. It started with small things. A disagreement over how to handle a business, venture I'd been offered. I wanted to take the risk, to step out of my comfort zone, while Andrew was hesitant, practical, urging caution. At first, it was just a conversation, a difference of opinion. But as time passed, it began to feel like something more, like an unspoken divide growing between us. I could feel the tension in the air when I'd come home after a long day, the silence thick between us as we prepared dinner in the kitchen. He'd be quieter than usual, his brow furrowed as he stirred the sauce, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. I would try to fill the space with casual conversation, but he would only respond in half-hearted sentences, distracted. It was the first time in a long while that I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the one that reminded me of the uncertainty we'd lived through. One evening, as we sat at the table, the silence became too much to bear. I put my fork down, meeting his gaze across the table. "Andrew," I said softly, my voice shaky. "What's going on?" He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I've just been thinking a lot about the future lately, about everything." I swallowed hard, the unease in my chest deepening. "About us?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window. "About everything," he repeated, his voice tight. The distance in his words hit me like a wave, and for a moment I was paralyzed. This wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't something I could point to as a clear sign of failure. It was just uncertainty. "Do you still want this?" I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. He met my gaze again, his eyes searching mine, as though trying to find the right words. "I do," he said quietly. "I want this. I don't know how to make sense of everything anymore." That night, we didn't talk much, but the words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. I lay in bed beside him, feeling the divide between us widening with every second. I reached for his hand, but he didn't respond, lost in his own thoughts. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of the end, the slow unraveling of what we had fought so hard to rebuild. The next few days were strained, our conversations clipped and polite, as though we were walking on eggshells. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken tension, an unresolved question that neither of us knew how to ask. It was a week later, during one of our usual quiet mornings at the cafe, that I found the courage to speak again. "Andrew," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "do you think we're slipping?" He looked up from his coffee, his face softening at the worry in my voice. "No," he said immediately, but his words were almost too quick. He placed his cup down, his fingers lingering on the edge. "I don't think we're slipping, Charlotte. I think we're just at a crossroads." I didn't know what to say to that. A crossroads. "We're still here," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "And I don't want to give up on us, but I need you to know that this is hard for me. It's hard for both of us. We've been through a lot, and I don't know if I'm always handling it the right way." I nodded, feeling the weight of his honesty. "I'm scared, Andrew," I confessed, my voice raw. "I'm scared that we're not the same people we were, and I don't know if we'll be able to hold on to this." He reached across the table, taking my hand gently in his. "I'm scared too," he said, his voice low. "But I believe in us. I believe we can work through it. We've already survived so much. And if we're being honest, I don't know if I'm ready to let go just yet." In the days that followed, we faced the uncertainty together, acknowledging the cracks that had appeared, but refusing to let them define us. As the months passed, Andrew and I slowly began to rebuild a new kind of relationship, one that was no longer rooted in the past, but in the present, a fragile but hopeful understanding that we both had something worth protecting. It wasn't perfect, and we still had our moments of hesitation, But there was something about the honesty we now shared that felt different from before. We learned to recognize the quiet moments between us, the ones where no words were needed but where we could simply sit together, feeling each other's presence. It was in these moments that I began to feel that we were stronger, perhaps even more resilient than before. We had survived the weight of our history and come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of each other and ourselves. But life, in its unpredictable way, continued to test us. It came in the form of a work opportunity I couldn't refuse, a chance to showcase my art on an international stage, a dream I had been chasing for years. But it wasn't just any opportunity. It would require me to travel, to be away from home for months, to leave behind the life I had spent so long rebuilding with Andrew. When I told him about the offer, there was a quiet pause before he spoke. "I think you should do it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. My heart sank. "I didn't expect you to say that." He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "Why not? This is your dream, Charlotte. You've worked so hard for this. I'm not going to stand in your way." But I could see it in his eyes, the uncertainty, the subtle ache of knowing that we would be apart for months. His words didn't mask the distance that had already begun to form between us. "I don't want to leave," I confessed, my voice trembling. "I'm scared of what it will do to us." Andrew took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm scared too, but I believe in us. We've been through so much already. A few months apart isn't going to break us." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hold on to that hope. But I couldn't ignore the nagging fear that had settled deep in my chest. Would we survive the distance? Could we really navigate the growing ache between us, the quiet longing that would only intensify with time? The weeks leading up to my departure were filled with a mixture of excitement and dread. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question. Would we still be the same when I returned? Would the space between us grow too wide? Andrew remained supportive, never once trying to make me feel guilty for leaving. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. His quiet moments, the pensive glances when he thought I wasn't looking, the distance that was beginning to form between us even in the smallest interactions. The night before I left, we sat together on the couch, our fingers entwined, the silence heavy between us. "I'll miss you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he said softly, "but we'll make it work. We always do." But there was an edge to his voice, a subtle strain that betrayed his calm exterior. I couldn't ignore it. The truth was, we didn't know how this would play out. We didn't know how to navigate the uncertainty that stretched before us, but we both understood that the next few months would test the very foundation of our relationship. In the weeks that followed, I immersed myself in the project, the excitement of seeing my work displayed on such a grand stage, pushing all other thoughts aside. But as the days passed, the absence of Andrew's presence began to feel like a void I couldn't ignore. The late-night texts and video calls became a fragile thread connecting us, but I could feel the distance growing with every passing day. I missed the simple things, his laugh, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at me, the quiet touch of his hand in mine. I missed the way we used to be, unspoken, comfortable, easy. And I couldn't help but wonder if this distance would change us forever. One evening, as I sat alone in my hotel room, the weight of the situation hit me all at once. I couldn't deny that something had shifted between us. We were still in touch, but it wasn't the same. The conversations were more strained now, more calculated. We talked about the details of our days, but there was a growing silence around everything else. The silence where we used to ask about each other's fears, dreams, the quiet moments that defined us. I missed him, and it was starting to feel like the more I missed him, the more impossible it was to bridge the gap between us. Then one evening, the message came. A simple text from Andrew. "We need to talk." My heart dropped into my stomach. I stared at the screen, my fingers frozen above the keys. What had happened? What was wrong? Had the distance between us grown too wide? We set a time to talk, and when the call came through, I could see the tension in his eyes before he even spoke. He had changed.